If you were a black child walking through school hallways in the 1980s, your experience was unlike anyone else's. These weren't just school days. They were lessons in survival, identity, and strength that no textbook could teach. Every morning brought challenges that other kids never faced, and every victory had to be earned twice. Here are 25 things that only black kids experienced in schools during the 1980s. Standing in those tiered rows for class pictures meant scanning the sea of faces and realizing yours was often the only one that looked like you. For black kids in the 1980s, integration was still new enough that many classrooms had only one or two black students out of 30. You learned to smile for the camera while carrying the weight of representation on your small shoulders. That annual photo became a visual reminder of how different your school experience was from your parents' generation, who had attended all-black schools where they saw themselves reflected everywhere. When you got home and showed that picture to your family, they would point you out with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing the isolation you faced daily. Some parents kept those class photos as proof of progress, evidence that their children were accessing opportunities they never had. For black kids in the 1980s, being the only one meant learning early that visibility came with responsibility, and that every action would be seen as a reflection of your entire race. Walking down the hallway or sitting at your desk meant being prepared for hands reaching out to touch your hair without warning or permission. White classmates, driven by curiosity about texture and style, would reach out and grab braids, touch afros, or run their fingers through pressed hair as if you were a museum exhibit. For black kids in the 1980s, this violation of personal space was a daily reality that teachers rarely addressed. You learned to duck, weave, and create protective barriers around your head during class. The touching came with questions that made you uncomfortable and comments that revealed how little your classmates understood about black hair care and culture. Some kids developed reflexes, spinning around quickly when they felt hands approaching. Parents prepared their children for this reality, explaining that some people had never seen hair like theirs and teaching them how to firmly but politely ask people to stop. For black students, protecting your hair became a skill as important as protecting your dignity. Every morning meant switching from the warm, familiar language of home to the careful, controlled speech that school demanded. For black kids in the 1980s, this linguistic juggling act was exhausting and necessary for survival in predominantly white educational spaces. At home, you could speak in the rhythm and cadence that felt natural, using expressions and vocabulary that connected you to your family and community. But walking through those school doors meant monitoring every word, avoiding slang, and speaking in ways that wouldn't trigger negative reactions from teachers or classmates. You learned which version of yourself was acceptable in which setting, often feeling like you were performing rather than just being. Some kids mastered this switch so well they could change mid-sentence depending on who was listening. Teachers praised students who spoke properly without understanding the cultural violence embedded in that expectation. For black children, code switching wasn't just about language. It was about learning to survive in spaces that demanded you diminish parts of yourself to be accepted. Standing in the cafeteria line with your free lunch ticket felt like holding a sign that announced your family's financial struggles to everyone around you. These colored tickets, or punch cards, mark students whose families qualified for reduced price or free meals, and for black kids in the 1980s, they often felt like brands of poverty. You learned to hold the ticket low, hoping classmates wouldn't notice, or to stand in specific lines where the stigma felt less obvious. Some kids develop strategies for hiding their lunch status, borrowing money from friends, skipping meals, or eating only the parts of lunch that looked like they could be purchased. Cafeteria workers who understood the situation tried to be discreet, but the system itself was designed in ways that made economic differences visible. Parents struggled with pride and practicality, knowing their children needed the nutrition but hating the shame it brought. For black students, free lunch was often essential for getting through the school day, but it came with social costs that followed them through hallways and into adulthood. Walking into honors or gifted classes meant facing the assumption that you had been placed there by mistake rather than merit. For black kids in the 1980s, academic excellence was met with surprise, skepticism, and constant pressure to prove you deserved to be there. Teachers would question your test scores, suggest you might be more comfortable in regular classes, or treat your success as an anomaly rather than evidence of ability. You learn to work twice as hard to receive the same recognition as white classmates. And even then, your achievements were often attributed to affirmative action rather than intelligence. Some kids internalize these messages, doubting their own abilities even when evidence proved otherwise. Parents had to advocate fiercely for their children's educational placement, often facing resistance from counselors and administrators who had low expectations for black student achievement. Group projects became minefields where you carried extra weight to prove your worthiness to be there. For black students in advanced classes, success required not just academic skill, but emotional resilience to withstand constant questioning of your right to be there. Whenever discussions about slavery, civil rights, or anything related to race came up in class, all eyes turned to you as if you were the official spokesperson for all black people everywhere. For black kids in the 1980s, this burden of representation felt crushing and unfair. But it happened so regularly that you learned to prepare responses in advance. Teachers would ask, "What do you think about this?" As if your individual opinion could somehow explain the experiences of millions of people. You felt the weight of potentially saying the wrong thing and reinforcing stereotypes, or the pressure to educate your classmates about experiences they should learn about from books and proper instruction. Some kids learned to deflect these moments, while others embraced the role of educator despite it not being their responsibility. The attention felt uncomfortable and isolating, marking you as different and putting you on display. Parents prepared their children for these moments, helping them understand that they were individuals, not representatives. For black students, being treated as a racial spokesperson stole opportunities to just be kids learning alongside their peers. Getting in trouble at school meant facing consequences that were often more severe than what white classmates received for identical infractions. For black kids in the 1980s, this disparity in discipline was a harsh introduction to systemic inequality that would follow them throughout life. A playground fight might result in suspension for you, while your white classmate got detention. Talking back to a teacher could lead to office visits, while similar behavior from others was dismissed as normal childhood testing of boundaries. You learn to be more careful, more controlled, and more aware of how your actions would be perceived and punished. Some kids developed anxiety around authority figures, knowing that any mistake could result in disproportionate consequences. Parents had to teach their children to be respectful and compliant in ways that felt unfair, but were necessary for survival. The school-to-prison pipeline was already forming, though it wouldn't be named for years. For black students, learning to navigate school discipline meant learning early lessons about injustice that shaped their relationships with authority for life. Opening your history textbook meant seeing a version of America where people who looked like you barely existed, and when they did appear, it was only in the context of slavery or as footnotes to white achievements. For black kids in the 1980s, educational materials reflected a whitewashed version of history that erased black contributions and made you feel invisible in your own country's story. Science books featured white inventors, literature classes focused on white authors, and social studies pretended that black people had done nothing significant beyond being enslaved. You learned about George Washington Carver and maybe Martin Luther King Jr., but the vast richness of black achievement, culture, and history remained hidden. Some kids supplemented their education at home, where parents shared stories and books that schools ignored. Teachers rarely acknowledged these gaps or made efforts to include diverse perspectives in their lessons. For black students, education meant learning to see past the limitations of curriculum that suggested they had no legacy worth studying, while simultaneously excelling in systems that refused to reflect their heritage. Recess meant entering a social minefield where racial dynamics played out in ways that adults rarely noticed or addressed. For black kids in the 1980s, playground politics could be especially complex, with friendships forming and dissolving along racial lines that reflected broader social tensions. You might be included in games one day and excluded the next, often without understanding what had changed. Some white kids were forbidden by their parents from playing with black children, creating painful moments of rejection that had nothing to do with your actions or character. You learned to read social cues carefully, understanding which groups were welcoming and which were not. Playground equipment sometimes became segregated by social dynamics rather than official rules. Some black kids found refuge by forming their own groups, creating spaces where they could play without constant negotiation of acceptance. Parents prepared their children for these social challenges while trying to maintain their confidence and self-worth. For black students, recess was rarely just fun and games. It was education in social survival and the early formation of strategies for navigating predominantly white spaces. Black History Month arrived each February like a brief spotlight that illuminated black achievements before shutting off again for the remaining 11 months of the school year. For black kids in the 1980s, this single month of acknowledgement felt both validating and insulting. finally seeing yourself in the curriculum, but only for 28 days. Teachers would suddenly pull out books about Black inventors, artists, and leaders that had been sitting unused all year. Bulletin boards that had featured white historical figures would suddenly bloom with pictures of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and George Washington Carver. You appreciated learning about Black excellence, but it felt hollow, knowing that March 1st would return everything to the regular curriculum where you disappeared again. Some kids felt pressure to participate in Black History Month presentations, becoming performers of their own heritage for classmates who would forget everything by April. Parents had mixed feelings about this concentrated attention, grateful for any recognition but frustrated by the limitations. For Black students, February became a month of pride mixed with the sadness of knowing that this brief visibility would soon end, leaving them invisible in their education once again. The first day of school meant sitting through roll call and waiting for the inevitable pause, mispronunciation, or request to just call you something easier when teachers reached your name. For Black kids in the 1980s with names that reflected their cultural heritage, this annual ritual was a painful reminder that their identity was seen as inconvenient or difficult. Teachers would butcher pronunciations without apology, suggest nicknames that stripped away cultural meaning, or simply avoid calling on students whose names they couldn't or wouldn't learn to pronounce correctly. You learned to correct pronunciation patiently, spell your name slowly, or sometimes give up and accept whatever version the teacher preferred. Some kids began going by completely different names at school just to avoid the daily struggle. Substitute teachers were especially challenging, often giving up entirely or making jokes about difficult names. Parents faced decisions about whether to give their children names that reflected their heritage or names that would be easier in predominantly white spaces. For Black students, having their names respected was a basic dignity that often had to be fought for, turning something as simple as attendance into a daily negotiation of identity. Speaking well in class or giving a good presentation meant receiving the compliment of being called so articulate with a tone of surprise that revealed low expectations. For Black kids in the 1980s, this backhanded praise became a familiar and frustrating experience that highlighted how unusual intelligence was considered for students who looked like you. Teachers, classmates, and administrators would express amazement at your vocabulary, your grammar, or your ability to express complex ideas as if these skills were unexpected from Black children. You learned that speaking well could be both an asset and a burden, opening doors while simultaneously marking you as an exception rather than the rule. Some kids internalize these messages, beginning to see their own intelligence as unusual or feeling pressure to constantly perform intellectual competence. Others develop pride in their abilities while recognizing the racist assumptions embedded in the surprise. Parents taught their children that intelligence was natural and expected, not exceptional. For Black students, being articulate wasn't just about communication, it was about challenging stereotypes every time they opened their mouths. School dress codes seemed specifically designed to police Black hairstyles, turning your natural hair texture and cultural styling into violations that could result in disciplinary action. For black kids in the 1980s, afros were often deemed distracting, braids were called unprofessional, and any style that didn't conform to European beauty standards risked punishment. You learned to navigate rules that seemed to specifically target your appearance while claiming to be neutral and fair. Some kids had to choose between expressing their cultural identity and avoiding trouble, leading to painful decisions about assimilation and authenticity. Parents fought battles with administrators over policies that unfairly singled out black students, often facing resistance and claims that rules were applied equally to everyone. Hair became a battleground for cultural expression and civil rights within school walls. Some families spent extra money on chemical relaxers or styles that would be deemed acceptable by school standards. For black students, dress codes were often the first introduction to systemic racism disguised as institutional policy, teaching early lessons about how rules could be written to appear neutral while targeting specific groups. Finding other black students in predominantly white schools meant creating informal networks of support, encouragement, and shared understanding that helped everyone survive and thrive. For black kids in the 1980s, these connections were lifelines that provided emotional support and practical strategies for navigating challenging environments. You shared study notes, warned each other about difficult teachers, and celebrated achievements that might be overlooked or minimized by the broader school community. These networks operated quietly, meeting in hallways between classes, at lunch tables, or after-school activities where black students naturally gravitated toward each other. Older black students mentored younger ones, passing down survival strategies and encouragement. Parents facilitated these connections, arranging carpools and study groups that brought black families together. Teachers rarely recognized these support systems, missing opportunities to understand and leverage the strength that came from community. For black students, these networks provided what the formal education system often failed to offer: validation, encouragement, and the message that academic success was expected and celebrated. These informal communities became training grounds for leadership and advocacy that would serve students throughout their lives. Group assignments meant facing the assumption that you would contribute less than your white classmates, leading to situations where you had to work harder to prove your worth and often ended up carrying more than your share of the load. For black kids in the 1980s, group projects became tests of belonging rather than collaborative learning experiences. Some classmates would express surprise when you contributed quality work, while others would automatically assume leadership roles without considering your capabilities. You learned to assert yourself firmly but carefully, knowing that being too aggressive could reinforce stereotypes, while being too passive could result in being excluded or marginalized. Some kids became masters at documenting their contributions to protect themselves when grading time came. Teachers rarely monitored group dynamics closely enough to notice these patterns or address them when they occurred. Parents advised their children to always be prepared to complete entire projects alone if necessary. For black students, group work became practice in managing workplace dynamics they would face as adults, learning to excel while managing others' assumptions and biases about their abilities and work ethic. Parent-teacher conferences meant watching your mother or father transform their speech, mannerisms, and sometimes entire personality to navigate meetings with educators who held power over your academic future. For Black kids in the 1980s, these conferences were masterclasses in survival and advocacy as parents balanced assertiveness with the need to be seen as cooperative and supportive. You watched your parents choose their words carefully, speak in ways that might not reflect how they talked at home, and remain calm in the face of low expectations or subtle discrimination. Some parents came prepared with documentation, questions, and strategies developed through community networks of other Black families facing similar challenges. You learned that advocating for your education required your parents to perform respectability in ways that felt uncomfortable but were deemed necessary. These meetings often revealed the gap between how you were perceived at home versus at school, showing you how racism operated in professional settings. For Black students, parent-teacher conferences became early lessons in how systemic inequality affected their families and how much extra work was required to ensure they received fair treatment in educational settings. Saturday morning television became a cultural lifeline that connected you to broader Black culture and provided representation that school never offered during the week. For Black kids in the 1980s, shows like Soul Train, Fat Albert, and the Jackson 5 cartoon provided images of Black excellence, creativity, and joy that counteracted the absence of positive Black representation in educational settings. You would wake up early to catch these programs, absorbing images of Black people who were talented, successful, and celebrated. These shows became topics of conversation with other Black kids at school, creating shared cultural references that strengthened your connections to your community. Parents appreciated these programs as supplements to education, providing cultural knowledge that textbooks ignored. Dancing along with Soul Train became practice for school talent shows, where you could showcase cultural styles that were valued in your community even if they weren't appreciated in classroom settings. For Black students, Saturday morning television provided weekly doses of cultural pride that helped sustain them through educational environments that often failed to reflect or respect their heritage. Academic success meant constantly exceeding expectations that had been set unreasonably low, proving over and over again that you belonged in accelerated programs and could handle challenging coursework. For Black kids in the 1980s, high achievement was often met with surprise rather than celebration, requiring extra emotional labor to advocate for appropriate academic placement and recognition. You learn to document your successes, seek out teachers who believed in your potential, and persist through discouragement that would have deterred less determined students. Some kids internalized low expectations and began to doubt their own abilities, while others used skepticism as motivation to prove doubters wrong. Parents became fierce advocates, arming themselves with test scores and examples of their children's work to fight for proper educational opportunities. Guidance counselors sometimes steered capable Black students toward vocational tracks rather than college preparatory courses, requiring families to actively resist these limiting recommendations. For Black students, academic excellence became an act of resistance against systems designed to minimize their potential. Teaching early lessons about perseverance and self-advocacy that would serve them throughout their educational and professional careers. Learning to navigate school successfully often meant developing the skill of being excellent without being threatening, achieving without attracting negative attention, and standing out for your accomplishments while blending in enough to avoid targeting. For Black kids in the 1980s, this balancing act required sophisticated social intelligence and emotional maturity beyond their years. You learn to read rooms quickly, understand which teachers were allies and which were obstacles, and adjust your behavior accordingly. Some kids became experts at flying under the radar while still participating fully in their education. Others learned to use humor, charm, or other social skills to disarm potential conflicts before they escalated. Parents taught strategies for success that included warnings about the dangers of being too visible or too confident in environments that might punish Black achievement. For Black students, survival meant developing complex social skills that allowed them to thrive academically while protecting themselves emotionally and physically from the consequences of standing out in predominantly white educational spaces. Creating genuine friendships with white classmates meant navigating complex social dynamics, family attitudes, and cultural differences while maintaining your own identity and self-respect. For Black kids in the 1980s, interracial friendships could be meaningful and transformative, but they often required careful management and emotional sophistication. You learned to educate friends about your culture without becoming their personal diversity educator, to challenge racist comments without losing relationships, and to maintain friendships despite family disapproval on either side. Some friendships survived these challenges and became lifelong bonds that enriched everyone involved. Others crumbled under the weight of social pressure, misunderstanding, or the realization that true friendship required mutual respect and understanding that wasn't always present. Parents provided guidance about navigating these relationships while protecting their children's emotional well-being. For Black students, interracial friendships became practice for the diverse world they would inhabit as adults, teaching valuable lessons about communication, empathy, and the possibility of building connections across racial lines. Academic achievements that might be routine for other students became powerful symbols of progress and possibility for Black families navigating educational systems that had historically excluded them. For Black kids in the 1980s, making honor roll, winning academic awards, or graduating from advanced programs represented not just individual success, but community triumph. These victories were celebrated with extended family, shared with neighbors, and preserved in photographs and newspaper clippings that documented progress. Parents understood that their children's educational success challenged stereotypes and created opportunities for future generations. Some achievements became inspiration for younger siblings and cousins who saw what was possible. Teachers who recognized and celebrated these accomplishments became beloved figures remembered for decades. For Black students, academic success carried extra weight because it represented breaking barriers, exceeding expectations, and creating pathways that others could follow. These victories, large and small, became building blocks for confidence and determination that sustained them through ongoing challenges. Supplementing your education at home with books, stories, and knowledge about Black history, achievements, and culture that were completely absent from school curriculum became a parallel education that filled crucial gaps in your understanding of the world. For Black kids in the 1980s, parents, grandparents, and community members provided historical context that textbooks ignored or distorted. You learned about Black inventors, scientists, artists, and leaders whose contributions had been erased from mainstream historical narratives. Family stories provided personal connections to larger historical movements, making abstract concepts real and relevant. Community events, church programs, and cultural organizations offered educational experiences that celebrated Black heritage and achievement. Some kids became walking encyclopedias of Black history, able to counter classroom discussions with facts that teachers didn't know. For Black students, this supplemental education provided cultural grounding and pride that helped them navigate educational environments that suggested their people had no significant legacy worth studying. Learning to recognize, process, and respond to subtle forms of racism that came disguised as innocent comments, jokes, or observations became a survival skill that required emotional strength and strategic thinking. For Black kids in the 1980s, microaggressions were daily experiences that chipped away at confidence and required constant vigilance to address or deflect. You learn to distinguish between ignorance and malice, to choose your battles carefully, and to protect your emotional energy while still advocating for respect. Some kids developed humor as a defense mechanism, while others became experts at direct confrontation when necessary. Parents provided coaching on how to handle these situations while maintaining dignity and safety. Teachers often missed these interactions entirely or dismissed them as misunderstandings when brought to their attention. For Black students, developing resilience to microaggressions was essential for psychological survival in predominantly white educational environments. But it shouldn't have been necessary for children to develop such sophisticated coping mechanisms for attending school. Participating in student leadership roles meant navigating political dynamics where your presence was often tokenistic, your ideas were filtered through racial assumptions, and your success was scrutinized differently than that of white peers. For Black kids in the 1980s who sought leadership positions, campaigns required building coalitions across racial lines while addressing issues that mattered to underrepresented students. You learned to speak for yourself while being expected to represent all Black students' interests, to propose initiatives that would benefit everyone while addressing specific needs of minority students. Some kids found their voice through student government and discovered their passion for advocacy and leadership. Others faced resistance, isolation, or undermining that taught painful lessons about institutional racism in democratic processes. Parents provided guidance about political strategy while encouraging their children to stay true to their values and communities. For Black students in leadership roles, student government became training ground for the advocacy work many would continue as adults. Learning to create change from within systems while maintaining authenticity and community connections. Walking across that graduation stage meant celebrating not just academic achievement, but survival through an educational system that often wasn't designed for your success, carrying forward lessons in resilience, advocacy, and excellence that would serve you throughout life. For Black kids in the 1980s, graduation represented triumph over low expectations, discrimination, and institutional barriers that had challenged every step of their educational journey. Family celebrations were especially meaningful because everyone understood the extra obstacles that had been overcome. These graduates entered the world with academic credentials and life skills that included navigating predominantly white institutions, advocating for themselves and others, and maintaining cultural identity while achieving success in mainstream environments. Some went on to historically Black colleges, where they could finally experience educational environments designed for their success. Others continued in predominantly white institutions, now equipped with strategies for thriving despite ongoing challenges. For Black students graduating in the 1980s, their diplomas represented not just individual achievement, but community progress and hope for future generations who would benefit from the paths they had helped create. These experiences shaped a generation of Black students who learned early that education was both a right and a battlefield, that success required not just intelligence, but courage, and that their achievements carried the dreams of entire communities. Which of these school experiences resonates most deeply with your own memories or your family stories? Drop a comment below, sharing how these challenges shaped your educational journey. Hit that like button and subscribe so we never forget the strength it took to learn and thrive in schools that weren't always designed for our success.